What is the absolute scariest book you've ever read? Your mileage may vary, but the scariest thing I've ever read is a novella by Fritz Leiber called Horrible Imaginings. It's the only piece of fiction that made me so uneasy that I had to put it aside for about 20 minutes before I returned to it. It's probably my favorite single horror tale. It has been reprinted in several books over the years, but the best one that contains it, in my opinion, is Fritz Leiber, Selected Stories, which is a terrific collection of horror, fantasy, and science fiction stories, virtually all of which are classics. It's a short story rather than a book, but Rats in the Walls by H.P. Lovecraft gets my vote. The pacing and the slow confluence of various details keep the story moving until the eventual and chilling end. Lovecraft tends to be ham-fisted with foreshadowing. In this story, he manages to not give away the ending on page 5, and that keeps the ending a genuine surprise. For me, the best part is the ending. I have a few nominations that all meet different criteria. In terms of a novel that just shoves the very worst of humanity down your throat, Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door takes the cake in that regard. The fact that it's a fairly accurate portrayal of a true story, albeit with fictional characters instead of the real-life victim and perpetrators, just makes it even more disgusting and bleak. In terms of a traditional horror, my pick is Stephen King's IT. There are some parts of that story that are shocking, vile, and terrifying all in one. The fact that King has absolutely no qualms about writing the detailed, horrific deaths of small children is quite disturbing. And then, as anyone who's read this demented, but amazing, novel is aware of, there's the sewer scene. In terms of why. Essentially, why was this written? What is wrong with everyone involved in its publication? Someone needs to go to prison over this. I would have to choose Justine by the Marquis de Sade. Very little plot to speak of, no character development, just horribly written sadistic pornography involving a young girl, yes, girl as in a child, who is abused in pretty much every way you can possibly think of and many more you probably can't. I have no idea why I stuck through this book to the end, but suffice it to say that the terror exuded through its pages is basically regarding the fact that a man like de Sade even existed at one point in time. An honorable mention is Stephen Kahn's novella The Library Policeman. While not one of his more well-known works, I found it quite unsettling and definitely not something I'd like to read alone by candlelight. I would say it is The Indifferent Stars Above by Daniel James Brown. It is technically not a horror book, it is a factual account of what happened to the Donner Party, based on letters, newspaper stories, and diaries. If someone doesn't know what the Donner Party was, it was a convoy that attempted to travel across the American continent from the East Coast to West in the 1840s. They took a shortcut that hadn't been tested with wagons, and their journey was delayed to the point where they missed their window to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains before snowfall. They were forced to camp at the base of the mountain for the winter, and having depleted their rations, they were driven to cannibalism. The book is an absolutely horrendous read. And also, educational LOL. It isn't a book, but it's a short story. It's called The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This story has always stayed with me, I don't know why. The ending of the story is something I've read over and over again and have done multiple reports on in university, but it still freaks me out. Probably because it has to do with mental illness back in the 1800s. I am currently reading Pet Sematary for the first time. I've never seen the movie either, and it's also disturbing, but not to the point of too scary to read. The Ritual, the first half of the book totally got in my head. I did quit after the twist though, but the first half stuck with me. Nightboat, McCammon's descriptions are very visceral. It honestly creeped me out. The Demon in the Freezer, a non-fiction book about diseases that really bothered me, but was also really interesting. I highly recommend it. There is a scene in Highmore by Graham Reynolds where a little boy is sent back to his treehouse to retrieve his father's tools he forgot there. He's in trouble and it's nighttime. He gets to the treehouse and a werewolf comes out of the denser part of the forest and notices him. I don't want to say anything else, but damn, the imagery I have from that chapter is so vivid I can still see it like I watched the movie last week. It's absolutely chilling. If you haven't read the book and enjoy monsters, it's a wicked read. Misery, by Stephen King, is the only book to ever really scare me. I read it as a teen and was terrified Annie Wilkes would be waiting for me in the hallway late at night as I sat up reading long after everyone else was asleep. The one that has stayed with me the longest is the short story, The Mezzotint, by Mr. James. The creeping dread is palpable. Honorable mention goes to Jonathan Aycliffe's Naomi's Room. It's the photographs of the attic that get me. I still think of it years later. I'm not that well versed in horror literature yet. I've mostly read Poe and Lovecraft, both of which I love, but I'm going to go with House of Leaves by Danny Liskey. It is at its core a tragic love story, but the horror is so palpable, and I also love the sort of found writing feel of it. It's kind of like found footage, but in written form. All of the footnotes and rambling appendixes make for an unreliable narrator, which I absolutely love, especially in Poe's stories. House of Leaves isn't an easy read, but the different style really pays off. So, I can't pick just one. Maybe someday I'll be able to narrow it down to the one scariest, but in the meantime, here are my finalists. The Amityville Horror by Jay Anson. Bag of Bones by Stephen King. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill. IT by Stephen King. Let the Right One In by John Ajvide Lindquist. Nyctophobia by Christopher Fowler. Pet Cemetery by Stephen King. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz and Stephen Gammell, not the reissue with Brett Hellquist's illustrations. The Troop by Nick Cutter. We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver. The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates. The Slithering Corpse was pretty scary to me as a kid. It was a children's scary story anthology, but it was pretty messed up. I don't think it should have been anywhere near a children's library. I still remember a few of the stories. Chuck Palahniuk's books horrify me lol. They are so over the top and the worldview is beyond grim. Nihilistic. Ghosts that he did years ago as wild and invisible monsters for sure. I mean, Clive Barker's Books of Blood is a multi-volume short story collection, but it contains some of the most amazingly terrifying and original stuff I've ever read. Pig's Blood Blues, Dread, Rawhead Rex, In the Flesh, The Forbidden, which eventually became the film Candyman, Midnight Meat Train, obviously the basis for the movie of the same name, In the Hills, The Cities. It's a whole gallery of horrific delights. The Wolfen by Whitley Strieber. The movie was okay but barely resembled the book. Best werewolf story ever. Others off the top of my head. Hell House on Haunted Hill by Shirley Jackson. Ghost Story by Peter Straub. Rats by James Herbert. The Fisherman by John Langan. The Lurking Fear by Lovecraft. The Mist by Stephen King. Hell House by Richard Matheson isn't here yet. Now it is. Salem's Lot, either, so now it is, too. For me, true stories are the scariest and most upsetting, though. The Richard Ramirez biography has made me lock my doors a lot more. I don't know if these are the scariest, but they are great ones I've read the past few years. The Shining by King. Very intense, though the cause of the haunting is a letdown for me. Julia by Straub. The Exorcist by Blatty. Hard to Put Down. Dracula by Stoker. I read this as a kid. I reread it last month. Absolutely fabulous. I shook my head several times at the twisted brilliance. Might be old, but still new. He was prepared to go the limit as much as contemporary horror authors. Baby Teeth by Stage. Very suspenseful. Imagica by Barker. More fascinating than horror. The book that kept me on the edge of my seat the most was Bird Box. I literally could not put it down, was holding my breath through most of it and finished it in one go. It ended up being 5:30 a.m. on a work night. But I don't think I would call it the scariest book. It didn't make me scared, it just made tense and amped up. The actual keep the lights on and feel like there's someone behind you scariest book, to me, was probably The Ritual. Yes, shock horror kicks me out of the sub. I even liked the second half. Neville is also really good at writing kidnap-type horror, which is why second place on my list is No One Gets Out Alive. Third place is probably The Secret of Ventriloquism. I didn't like it that much, but it definitely scared me. I don't see this last one pop up on here a lot, but it's a collection of short stories. The style rubbed me the wrong way at first, and I didn't get why the story seemed to have little payoff, but I'm glad I stuck with it. It definitely still sticks with me. Survivor by J. F. Gonzalez. It works more like an extreme thriller, but it's absolutely horrifying. It contains some of the most disturbing things I've read in a book. Dark Debts by Karen Hall. If possession stories are your thing, give this a whirl. It's a short story by Joe Hill and the compilation Flight or Fright, but You Are Released has stuck with me and was one of the scariest things I've read. The sense of hopelessness it gave me stuck hard. For me, it's Secret Life by David M. Jacobs. It's about hypnotic regressions on real alien abductees. I don't know if it really exists, I hope not. It's sci-fi rather than horror, but The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell gave me nightmares and made me cry actual tears. The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. Two canoeing adventurers in a darkly atmospheric, isolated, river wilderness. And those willows, constantly moving, creeping. Scared me when I first read it decades ago. Still does. Cater by David Moody. I gave me nightmares and I would wake up fighting and screaming some nights. It was an intense read. I am currently halfway through The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher, and it is almost unbearably scary. This is a popular one, but Nick Cutter's The Troop messed me up. I've only read one book that scared me, and that was only because I'd been administered too much sodium pentothal. It was some R.L. Stine book. Other than that, I've got the two most intense horror novels. The Girl Next Door, obviously. And Nowhere to Hide by R. Patrick Gates.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.